everything is just atoms banging around. And that would include my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
All right, my thoughts are just, my brain is doing what these chemicals would always do under these conditions and at this temperature.
And this arrangement of...
And at this temperature. So I'm just, my thoughts are nothing more than brain gas. Welcome to Darwin Denied. We are continuing to work through a series of books that we believe are essential to understanding the creation-evolution debate. So Darwin Denied, The Essential Bookshelf. I'm Douglas Wilson. This is my brother, Dr. Gordon Wilson. And we're taking turns presenting various books that we've read on this topic that we think would be good for you all to read. And it's my turn this week, and the book I've selected is Mind and Cosmos. Mind and Cosmos.
With lots of Post-it notes.
With Post-it notes, because I'm gonna read you some things. And this is by a philosopher, Thomas Nagel. He is an atheistic philosopher, not a Christian, not an advocate of intelligent design. But in our discussions of these things, we've divided the books into three broad categories. They've been creationists, people who just take the biblical account of creation straight up and who write in defense of that in scientific terms. So the creationists. Then there are the intelligent design people who want to be more modest in their claims. They don't want to be defending the Genesis account, but they want to say that the artifacts that we find around us, are clearly, plainly, evidently designed. They aren't saying by whom necessarily, but they're clearly designed. And then there are people who are not believers, not advocates of intelligent design, although they have some respect for the arguments, as we'll see. But they just say Darwinism is bankrupt. It just doesn't hold water. So there's some people who've changed from one ship to another ship, that one they believe is more seaworthy. But these people, like Thomas Nagel, an atheist, just is on his own ship and he sinks it.
Yeah, sinks his own ship, and they're just treading water.
But he says, I have to do this because intellectual honesty requires it. So what I'd like to do is read you the subtitle here, then just read a few excerpts, and then read the blurb on the excerpt on the back cover, and then we can take our discussion from there. Mind and Cosmos, this is a philosopher, and the subtitle is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. So why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. And when I get to the last quote, we'll cash it out, why he thinks that. The first quote I'd like to introduce is, physico-chemical reductionism in biology is the orthodox view, and any resistance to it is regarded as not only scientifically but politically incorrect. But for a long time, I found the materialist account of how we and our fellow organisms came to exist hard to believe, including the standard version of how the evolutionary process works. So he just finds it not compelling. But notice that his target is reductionism. In simple terms, reductionism says that if there is no God and all that exists is time and chance acting on matter,
and energy,
matter and energy being
slash
same old.
Right. Can be transformed from one to
the other.
Back and forth.
So if that's all it is, then everything is just atoms banging around, and that would include my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
All right, my thoughts are just, my brain is doing what these chemicals would always do under these conditions and at this temperature.
And this arrangement of...
and at this temperature. So I'm just, my thoughts are nothing more than brain gas. It's just, and so hence I have no reason for believing my thoughts to be true, and hence I have no reason for believing I have a brain or that there's such a thing as an atom. Mm-hmm. I've completely sawn off the limb that I'm sitting on. So reduction,
And he knows that.
and he clearly knows that. My skepticism, he flies his atheist flag early. This is still in the introduction. My skepticism is not based on religious belief or on a belief in any definite alternative. It is just a belief that the available scientific evidence, in spite of the consensus of scientific opinion, does not in this matter rationally require us to subordinate the incredulity of common sense. This is especially true with regard to the origin of life. So it doesn't matter how many scientists you get to shout down the simple man who says clearly.
Seems it's designed to me. Yeah.
Seems so the reductionistic blind chance grinding away, producing this, seems to fly in the face of common sense at every turn. And it's very clear, if he's still an atheist, and he is, it's very clear that he really doesn't have an alternative.
Right.
He says, but he respects certain people in our camp, and that's a fatal mistake, I think.
Yeah.
He says, in thinking about these questions, I've been stimulated by criticisms of the prevailing scientific world picture from a very different direction. The attack on Darwinism, mounted in recent years from a religious perspective by the defenders of intelligent design. Even though writers like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer are motivated at least in part by their religious beliefs, the empirical arguments they offer against the likelihood that the origin of life and its evolutionary history can be fully explained by physics and chemistry are of great interest in themselves.
Right.
So he's saying, okay, your arguments have weight. Right? Your arguments have weight. And then he goes on. Another skeptic, David Berlinski, who is in the same boat.
In his camp.
He's in the same boat. He's not a believer, but he is disillusioned with Darwinism. Another skeptic, David Berlinski, has brought out these problems vividly without reference to the design inference. Even if one is not drawn to the alternative of an explanation by the actions of a designer, the problems that these iconoclasts pose for the orthodox scientific consensus should be taken seriously.
Yes.
They do not deserve the scorn with which they are commonly met. It is manifestly unfair. So Thomas Nagel is one of the world's most respected philosophers, and he sees that the Darwinian establishment is simply trying to shout down people.
Right. It reminds me of the man born blind, when the man born blind just had a lot of common sense.
Yeah.
He hadn't quite sorted it out, but the Pharisees are kind of like the neo-Darwinians.
Yeah.
It's just like, how dare you lecture us? You've
Right.
been steeped in sins since you were born. And
Right.
it's a similar, very parallel dialogue, because you've been steeped in ignorance since you were born. You are totally uneducated. You don't get it. We are the intelligentsia.
So here he says, I confess to an ungrounded assumption of my own in not finding it possible to regard the design alternative as a real option. I lack the sensus divinitatis that enables, indeed compels, so many people to see in the world the expression of divine purpose, as naturally as they see in a smiling face the expression of human feeling. So he says, I just don't, whatever it is that's in everybody's soul, I don't have it.
Yeah.
But I think he's wobbling. I think he's in greater danger than he realizes. But he's still an atheist. Then the last quote from within the book, biology. He says, so if mind is a product of biological evolution, and this is a huge problem for the reductionist. So if mind is a product of biological evolution, if organisms with mental life are not miraculous anomalies, but an integral part of nature, then biology cannot be a purely physical science. In other words, if mental activity is a thing, if consciousness is a thing,
right,
we can't explain what's going on in terms of atoms banging around. The reductionism doesn't cut it. So, and this, two things off the back cover. This is a quote from the book. The existence, and this is the hinge, I think, for him. The existence of consciousness is both one of the most familiar and one of the most astounding things about the world. No conception of the natural order that does not reveal it as something to be expected can aspire even to the outline of completeness. And if physical science, whatever it may have to say about the origin of life, leaves us necessarily in the dark about consciousness, that shows that it cannot provide the basic form of intelligibility for this world. There must be a very different way in which things as they are make sense, and that includes the physical world, since the problem cannot be quarantined in the mind. Right. So that's one striking thing. The other striking thing is the Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press. The doubts are starting. When you're boiling a pot of water, a bubble comes to the surface, and another one, and another one. Right. The fact that some of these books are being published by places
secular publishers
like OUP indicates that there is significant trouble.
There's a leak in the dike.
Now, so if I could circle back around, this is what he's doing is he's just deconstructing Darwin, sinking the ship he's on in the middle of the Atlantic, and no life raft.
Right.
He just doesn't. He doesn't have an alternative.
Does he address ethics? I mean, you talk about consciousness, but does he address the implications that there's no absolute ground by which to build any kind of ethical standard?
I don't remember if he addresses that, but the structure of his argument would, if someone came along and said, and so this would follow also, I think he would be compelled to say yes. The thing that's interesting is
because when you talk about fairness, you were saying, oh, it's just not fair to just dismiss these ID guys that have done their homework out of hand just because you think they have some religious motivation.
Yeah, he respects argument, but why? If there is no God, why respect argument? But that's all he's got. So he sank the ship, but he's hanging on to a plank still.
Right.
This reminds me there's several things. One is another iconoclast, not in the believing camp, was the late Tom Wolfe. His last book was The Kingdom of Speech, and what for Nagel is the problem of consciousness, reflection. Here I am thinking thoughts that correspond to the outside world. How do you account for that? Tom Wolfe, for him, it was language. Right. Language is this inexplicable phenomenon, and they say, look, anybody who's reflecting at all on this understands that this is a huge problem. And the final thing is I recently wrote an essay on C.S. Lewis's argument. I called it "The Light from Behind the Sun," and Lewis had severe doubts about Darwin prior to his conversion, and
how come he pays lip service to it in Mere Christianity?
Lip service and seemingly more than lip service in The Problem of Pain. There are different comments that he makes at different places, and where he doesn't. Not only does he not sound like a creationist, he sounds like a theistic evolutionist in places. But then when you look at The Magician's Nephew and Perelandra, both fictional treatments of the origin of a world, it's right out of a Sunday school book.
Right.
Adam and Eve, it's he does that. But the thing that's interesting, and this is there's a book called, in fact, I might add this to our list. C.S. Lewis
The books begin to multiply.
Yes. C.S. Lewis, anti-Darwinist. And Lewis was good friends with a gentleman who's a creationist, and a strict creationist. And he was the head of or involved with the Creationist Society in England at the time. And that movement would have been very small at the time.
Right.
But he was genuinely friends. He would put him up in his rooms at college when the guy came through. Forgotten his name. Begins with a B. I ordered one of his books, and and Lewis corresponds with him, and it's very clear that what Lewis regards as what we would call microevolution I think Lewis would call evolution as a biological theorem, and what we would call macroevolution as a worldview, Lewis would reject.
Okay.
So he wrote and I think there's some inconsistencies there too, but he wrote an essay called "Funeral of a Great Myth," and this funeral of a great myth was evolution.
Right.
And he says in it, it appeals to every part of me but my reason. And but the thing that's striking is, and I think he grew increasingly dubious about Darwin as the years went by, but he had doubts about Darwin before he was converted, and those doubts about Darwin were part of the reason why he was converted. And it was this issue that brought Lewis around, and it was this: if my thoughts are just chemicals, then
chemical reaction.
Just chemical
Very
reaction.
complex, but chemical reactions nonetheless.
But there's no more you have no more reason for assigning a link up between the chemical reactions here and facts out in the world than you would have of linking the waving of grass in a meadow to the fluctuations of the stock market. There's no, it's just atoms banging around. There's no internal structure. You have no reason for calling anything true or false. There's just no basis for it. So
I would trying to think the way they would think is that they would say that natural selection selected for these chemical reactions to respond accurately to the environment, such that if a predator was chasing you and you were perceiving reality wrong and ran towards it,
right,
you would be eaten, and thus you would end your lineage. But those that were perceiving reality correctly would run away, and thus increase the chance of surviving, and then pass on those fleeing genes to the next generation. So there's always a bit of there's always a toehold of logic, but then it always boils back down to is it we may have talked about this before. You can always explain that this is more of a selective advantage than that.
Right.
The issue is not that, think of some evolutionary biologists have actually compared market pressure to natural selection. And they actually compared car evolution to biological evolution, and the market being natural selection. But he sort of, by sleight of hand, would ignore the fact that there's automotive engineers along the way to go from a Model T to an advanced modern-day car.
There's a designer.
There's a designer to add driver's side air. Once you put in driver's side and passenger side airbags and airbags all around, you can say, well, obviously that's an advantage to the car. And thus, and people will want to buy that car. So that's a selective advantage. And then it reproduces. That's natural selection. The problem is natural selection didn't get you the airbags.
Yeah.
It selected the airbags. You have to rely on something else, which is intelligence and design.
You reminded me of something else, and then I'll like to circle back.
I may have been getting off the topic, but
this is all on the topic,
right?
But the famous experiments where they try to create life in the laboratory.
Oh yeah, the origin of life. Oh, don't get me started.
But the thing that amazes me about those things is they do not see them. They don't see themselves in the experiment. So they try to recreate the primordial goo, whatever
soup,
the soup, the primordial soup. They try to get all the preconditions in there. They try to zap it with the electricity that would be presumably the lightning strike on the pond, and they came up with something. It wasn't
a few amino acids.
They came up with that, and they said, "Ta-da!" And I would say, okay, the vat corresponds to the pond. The electrical charge corresponds to the lightning. Who do you correspond to?
Right.
Are you the spirit? Are you the spirit of God hovering over the deep?
Hovering over the waters. Make sure the conditions are reducing atmosphere, because if it was an oxidizing atmosphere, you wouldn't get biological molecules and all sorts of things. So you're sort of cherry picking the chemical and atmospheric conditions, that will get you the best thing. But even if you grant them all of their preconditions to make the primordial soup the best possible scenario for, you're still always dead end. It's always getting Scrabble letters. Scrabble letters corresponding to whether it's amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. But you can never, the one thing that they can't get in any kind of naturalistic scenario or a naturalistic experiment is they cannot have naturalism produce mind and purpose and goal and the whole thing of just, it's all chemicals, factors out some very essential ingredient, which is all the ID people are pushing. Doug Axe, Steve Meyer might be. It's this idea that intelligence and information is something that is a sort of an intangible. It's a thing. We all know information. We all know intelligence, but it doesn't weigh anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't weigh. You can have I may have said this before, you can have an empty thumb drive with not a thing on it, and it weighs the same as something that's just totally chock full of files. So it's not, information is not a substance. It's an arrangement of matter. And just like a dead person's brain isn't going to weigh, less than somebody right before he died, all of the,
or take another.
All of those
thoughts.
When you're
setting up a website, sometimes they've got that bogus Latin text that you can. It's a fake. This is what text looks like on this website. If you printed a book with the same number of pages with that
and as much toner
and as much same amount of toner, everything, the book full of sense would not weigh any more than the book full of nonsense, gibberish. So what they're not doing is they're not taking into account the spirituality of logic.
Mm-hmm.
Logic and reason are spiritual realities.
It's sort of a metaphysical.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't have a color. Doesn't have a taste.
Right.
How much does that argument weigh? Is it sour or bitter? What sort of it? None of that. So if just before we leave the creation of life thing, I wanted to point out that people are just not thinking about this. They don't see themselves hovering over the vat as being a factor in this. Mm-hmm. But let's say they succeeded in creating life. Let's say I'm a scientist,
right?
And I succeeded at nothing. I got
all the parts
everything
together in the right arrangement.
I created life in my vat. And then a scientist in France read the journal in which I published my results. He copied my experiment down to the nth degree. He duplicated my experience and got exactly the same results, and then held a press conference announcing that he'd exploded forever the myth of Doug Wilson's existence.
Right.
And his argument for proving that I didn't exist would be that he successfully copied my work.
Right.
That's how this.
Right.
I wanted to say something else.
Or if someone actually did create life and wanted to keep his patented it,
right,
and wanted to keep that as a deep, deep secret, and someone somehow got access to it and did it and said,
I broke into his house.
I created life by chance. Life formed in my lab.
Yeah.
And the person who knows he copied it said, "No, you got all of that recipe from me." And you could actually do, if it was a lawsuit, you could actually prove that no, you did copy this guy because we know that it didn't happen by chance.
I wanted to say something about the issue is not so much logic, but the authority of logic, the moral authority of logic. So you pointed out that the person who runs from a predator is going to have a survival advantage, recognizing that it is a predator and running from it in truth. If he runs the wrong direction, it'll be devoured. But I can imagine any number of other situations where your survival advantage would be increased if you committed 3 logical fallacies in a row and then cried. right, right. Mother, you have to let me. You have to.
Right.
And so, why do
if most people are, and we know if you do a survey, many people are illogical.
Right.
And yet, why wasn't that weeded out of the population?
Because it works.
It works. Yeah.
Because
and this small minority that says we are just quintessent, very logical. How come that logic didn't spread?
Yeah.
Because very far.
So if I can take your point. If someone says the logical fallacy that mistakes a leopard for a butterfly and vice versa is going to deselect. Right.
Yeah.
But a logical fallacy that manipulates other people is going to get all kinds of stuff, and they're going to be committing logical fallacies. But someone would say, "But you ought to tell the truth. You ought to speak the ought."
Yeah. As soon as you say ought, you have no Darwinian basis for that. And yet, the secular institutions expect their students not to cheat. Why?
Right.
Well, because we just can't build society on people who cheat. Well, dung beetles seem to do fine stealing each other's dung balls. There's stealing is rife in the animal kingdom.
Yeah,
they'll often pick and choose which things they want to copy.
Birds are particularly dishonest.
So
back to this issue of consciousness. So consciousness is for all of us like a pair of old slippers or a favorite pair of jeans.
Mm-hmm.
We don't notice it anymore because we're just walking through life conscious.
Mm-hmm.
But when you reflect on your consciousness, why is it that I'm here looking out at the world?
And why do I sense self-awareness of me? Here I am. I exist. Am I just, we don't think of a simple cell as having self-awareness.
Right.
Why is it that a certain number of chemical or cellular connections in the brain, why billions and billions of those connections make for consciousness? If we built a computer big enough to have that many circuits, of course, the reductionists would say, yeah, we can build a computer big enough to.
And that's what that's what the AI artificial intelligence people think that they're going to be able to do. But I think that people like Nagel and people like me have our doubts about our ability to produce true consciousness. You can produce things that are spooky in their ability to mimic consciousness,
right?
Like your phone, talking to you.
Yeah,
it looks like the phone's been thinking about what I'm saying, but that's just an optical illusion. It's just a complicated
program
parrot.
Yeah,
complicated parrot. So the authority of self-awareness or the authority of self-consciousness, Nagel is saying there is no way to account for this on a reductionist paradigm where all that is matter and energy and time, because the this is not material.
Mm-hmm.
So the reductionist excludes consciousness as a thing simply by definition.
Well, do they?
Yeah, they have to, because they would say that
they wouldn't say it's
epiphenomena.
Yeah,
but in
emergent
order to be
property based on this arrangement, it emerges as a natural consequence of this many connections.
But in order to be a natural consequence, it's got to be natural. It would have to be made up of atoms. So brain gas.
Well,
the brain gas it cannot, according to the reductionist, it cannot be purely spiritual.
Right.
It's got to weigh something. It's got to have atoms in it. And it's got to be the sum total of those atoms. And if you put those same atoms in a configuration above your toaster, it would have the same the same consciousness. It's just brain gas that is wafting off of the brain, and if it wafts into nothingness, then it's nothing. It doesn't have any reality.
Well, that especially when you're thinking about different thoughts in the consciousness, some are conservative, some are liberal, some are libertarian. You've got all of these different opinions, and some people are very, very adamant about the truth of their opinion. But all of these things, even anger, emotion, all the emotions, all the thoughts, all the opinions are all neurochemical reactions,
right?
Complex neurochemical reactions. So what is judgment?
Yeah.
Judgment is just yet another neurochemical reaction that wants to sit in judgment over all the other neurochemical reactions. And and then one emotional neurochemical reaction is, who made you ruler and judge over all neurochemical reactions? They're all in the, as a reductionist, you have to just say that there's no way to arbitrate which neurochemical reaction, whether it's a creationist thought or a ID thought or an evolutionary thought, they're just all neurochemical reactions. And there's no way to sit in judgment on it except to take one pick among all of these different viewpoints and say, you're the ruler and judge over all these other neurochemical. It's just like laughable.
Yeah.
To say that all of this, what you call brain gas, which I would say you would need a new metaphor, because it'd say it's not gas. It's not. they would say it's just a biochemical reaction, but not.
But it has to be a biochemical reaction on their terms.
Yeah.
It's got to be a biochemical reaction in the material world.
Right. Some kind of reaction. Just not something that's
but what Nagel's
bubble.
But what Nagel's talking about is something spiritual. It's not material. It has no weight, has no mass, has no color, has no taste. And yet here I am thinking my thoughts that don't weigh anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think if I think right now that it's raining outside, and that's let's say it happens to be true, and then I say it's raining outside and it happens to be false. Well, those are just, I'm aware of this. So why do I say T and F when I go outside and check that these thoughts somehow corresponded to what's going on out there?
Right.
There is simply no accounting for this. And back to Lewis, he says that when you talk to scientists about this, and not only do they not have an answer for this question, but they cannot even be brought to the point where they see the nature of the problem, indicates to him, Lewis said, a radical disease in their whole system of thought.
Yeah.
It's basically the world is a spiritual place.
Yep.
And you have as much evidence of the spiritual realm as you do, in fact, more evidence of the spiritual realm than you do of the existence of this book.
Yeah.
Because
even a thought that makes my physical brain send a signal to my hands to do this movement is a metaphysical, because my spirit has to interface somehow with the neurons to send the message. If there is no spirit that interfaces with the neurons, then I am just
complex chemical reaction.
I'm just a complex chemical reaction and every bit of all my behavior is a sum total of the matter that's in me, and it's truly reductionist. And then you can't really say, the whole idea of crime. It's like, well, you're responsible, you're culpable, but it's just what I do under these temperatures and pressures.
Mind and Cosmos. This is a philosophical takedown of Darwinism. Why Darwinism is almost certainly false, as he puts it. And even though he doesn't see his way clear to the Christian faith yet, he does some very valuable work. And it was it was it was highly disconcerting when he published this to a bunch of
How
bunch
old
of
is
people.
he, and how much time does he got left to come around?
Oh, let's see. He's got, looks like he's
60s.
60s probably. So thank you.
Thank you.
Called Conference challenges Christian high school students to become the next generation of cultural leaders. Talks given throughout the week encourage high school students to put on the whole armor of God, engage culture, and advance the kingdom in all areas of life. Check out this year's Called Conference by visiting calledconference.ninja. That's this summer, July 15th to the 20th, here in Moscow, Idaho. Sign up today at calledconference.ninja.